Alright, let's get into it. If you've been around this channel for a while, you already know how I approach this stuff. I'm not here to act like spicy games are some weird side category that only exist for novelty. If a game has strong atmosphere, memorable mechanics, a world that pulls you in, or characters that make you want to keep going, then it deserves attention. That's the whole point. This time, I'm not locking the video into one specific genre like RPGs, strategy, or horror. The focus here is simpler than that. 5 spicy games that stand out enough that I think you should know about them right now. Different styles, different pacing, different goals, but every one of them has something that makes it feel distinct. Some of these are more action-heavy, some lean into story and atmosphere, some are built around progression loops that hook you, and some are just plain unusual in a way that makes them hard to forget. That variety is exactly why I wanted to do this list. Because one of the most interesting things about spicy indie games is how often they experiment. Mainstream games usually play it safe. These don't. Sometimes that leads to something messy. Sometimes it leads to something weird. And every once in a while, it leads to something that hits way harder than people expect. So yeah, 5 spicy games that you need to check out right now. Just 5 games that do enough on their own terms to deserve a spot on your radar. Cyan Brain is one of those games that gives you a strong first impression, and then keeps pushing that impression deeper the longer you stay with it. From the moment it starts, the tone is harsh, unstable, and uneasy. You wake up with a nameless protagonist in a world that already feels damaged beyond repair, and the game wastes no time making it clear that this is not going to be a comfortable ride. The setup is simple on paper. A woman wakes up with no memory of who she is, where she is, or what happened to her. No tutorial voice holding your hand, no friendly NPC explaining the situation, no clean objective marker that reassures you everything will make sense in a few minutes. You're dropped into a ruined city where machines stalk the environment. Flesh and metal seem to blur together in disturbing ways, and pieces of a larger truth are scattered around like fragments of a broken mind. That mood carries everything. The city itself feels like the result of something catastrophic, but not in a loud cinematic way. It's decayed, oppressive, and hostile in a way that suggests the worst part already happened before you arrived. You're not witnessing the collapse, you're moving through the leftovers. That's part of what makes Cyan Brain work so well visually. It doesn't try to build a giant polished dystopia full of spectacle. It builds a place that feels wounded. As you move through it, you start finding traces of the organization known as the Church. And the more the game reveals about them, the uglier things become. This isn't a comforting religious structure bringing order to chaos. This is the source of experimentation, control, and violation. The force tied directly to what was done to the protagonist. Slowly, the game reveals that her body has been transformed into a weapon. Not metaphorically, not in some chosen one fantasy sense. In a literal, invasive, horrifying way. That's where the identity themes start hitting. Because Cyan Brain is not just about surviving a ruined world. It's about trying to understand who you are after your body, your past, and even your sense of self have been torn apart and repurposed. The memory fragments you collect are a huge part of that. They don't come in clean chronological order. They don't explain everything neatly. You get pieces, and those pieces don't always line up in a comforting way. That keeps the story abstract, sometimes frustratingly so. But it also gives the whole experience a haunted quality that sticks. A lot of players either click with that or bounce off it hard. If you like vague, symbolic storytelling, where the emotional tone matters as much as the literal plot, Cyan Brain can hit really hard. There's a constant sense of despair, rebirth, violation, and transformation hanging over everything. The game is clearly interested in suffering as part of both its narrative and its visual identity. If you prefer stories that explain themselves clearly and reward you with straightforward answers, this can feel deliberately obscure. Gameplay helps balance that out, because Cyan Brain is not just standing around being moody. It's a side-scrolling action shooter, and when it gets moving, it gets aggressive fast. Combat is tight, direct, and built around intensity. You're using firearms, mounted weapons, and whatever else you can find to cut through grotesque enemies and hostile machines that don't give you much breathing room. There's a kind of arcade brutality to it. Shots feel violent, impacts feel messy, defeats feel personal. Even the execution animations and death sequences reinforce that sense that survival here is not clean or heroic. It's ugly. There's a strong push-pull between ranged combat and desperation. Ammunition runs out, situations get tighter, enemies get into your space. That's when the melee side kicks in, and the game becomes more frantic. It never turns into some giant combo-based system, but it does a good job of making you feel like you're scraping through encounters with whatever you have left. That pressure gives the action a lot more identity than run right, shoot thing. Then you get the survival layer on top. Hydration is one of the stranger mechanics, and it sounds minor until you realize how much it affects your rhythm. Managed properly, it gives you access to healing resources, which means even a basic maintenance mechanic starts feeding back into the combat loop. That's one of the things I like about the design here. It's short, but it keeps finding ways to make your movement through the world feel connected to your survival instead of separating everything into isolated systems. Visually, it goes hard. Anime-inspired character work, detailed sprite animation, cinematic cuts, blood-heavy encounters, environmental decay. It has a very strong visual identity. Whether you like the adult material or not, the game definitely knows the kind of image it wants to project. For some players, that confidence is part of the appeal. For others, it crosses the line into relying too much on shock. That split in reception makes sense. Cyan Brain is not subtle. It doesn't want to be. And even when the gameplay gets repetitive, or when the short runtime leaves you wishing there were a bit more substance around the edges, it still leaves an impression because of how committed it is to its own tone. Cyan Brain feels like a game made by people who had a very specific nightmare in mind and decided to build an action shooter inside it. That alone makes it memorable. It won't land for everyone, but if you're into strange, punishing indie games with sharp presentation, heavy atmosphere, and a story that feels more like a wound than a plot summary, this is one you should absolutely know about. Sakura Gozen is the kind of game that catches people off guard because of how comfortable it feels once you settle into it. On paper, it sounds like a fairly simple anime-style side-scrolling action RPG set in a feudal-inspired world. You've got a disgraced samurai, a young girl who becomes central to the story, a tournament looming in the distance, and a journey built around rebuilding a fighting style that has basically fallen apart. That setup is familiar enough that you might expect the game to just coast on charm. But what makes Sakura Gozen stick is the way it turns that simple structure into something warm, steady, and surprisingly easy to get invested in. The story begins with Sakura Uka at the lowest point in her life. She's a samurai, technically skilled, but also reckless, a little foolish, and stuck in a peaceful era where her strengths don't line up neatly with what the world needs from her. After getting humiliated over something small and losing the basic foundations of her life, her weapons, her home, her dignity, she's left in a place where rebuilding herself stops being a noble fantasy and starts becoming a necessity. That alone gives the early game a nice angle. This isn't a chosen hero marching toward destiny. This is someone who hit rock bottom for reasons that are half tragic and half embarrassing. That makes Sakura a much more approachable lead than some ultra-serious warrior archetype. She has flaws, and the game is comfortable showing them. Then Suzune enters the picture, and that's where Sakura Gozen finds its emotional center. Sakura rescues this young girl from danger in a red light district, and from there, the relationship between the two becomes the thing that keeps the whole game moving. It's not handled like some quick narrative gimmick either. Their bond is the spine of the story. Sakura starts as a mess. Suzune brings out something protective and steady in her. And from there, the journey becomes less about abstract honor and more about what it means to become someone worth following. That's a big part of why the game works. The master-disciple dynamic could have been one note, but instead, it gives the progression structure emotional weight. Every step forward in combat, training, or reputation feels tied back to the idea that Sakura is rebuilding herself in front of someone who believes in her. Gameplay supports that nicely. The action side is side-scrolling and pretty straightforward, but it has enough feedback and momentum to stay fun. You're moving through areas, dealing with enemies using melee attacks and skills, and slowly expanding your options as Sakura regains strength. The combat is not hyper-complex, and that's probably a good thing. It leaves room for the progression loop to do its job. You're not spending the whole game fighting the controls or memorizing some giant system. You're fighting, leveling, learning a few patterns, and watching your toolset open up at a pace that feels comfortable. That sense of comfort matters because Sakura Gozen is built around repetition, but mostly the good kind. Town requests, dungeon runs, side objectives, Incremental upgrades, reputation growth, and training all stack into a loop that feels pretty relaxing once you fall into it. There's something satisfying about taking on a quest, clearing out a section, coming back a little stronger, and knowing you're slowly moving toward the Gozen-Gi tournament that serves as the game's main milestone. That tournament setup is smart too. Instead of making the story feel like a vague, get stronger because reasons journey, the game gives you a concrete destination. You know what Sakura is working toward. Winning the castle tournament is both symbolic and mechanical. It's her chance to rebuild her style, reclaim her honor, and prove that she's not finished. The world around that goal is simple, but lively enough to support it. Uma doesn't feel gigantic, but it does feel like a place where Sakura has to earn back visibility, helping townspeople, building reputation, getting involved in smaller local issues. All of that feeds into the feeling that her recovery is happening in public, not in some isolated training montage. People notice, they react. That gives your progress a little more texture. Visually, Sakura Gozen goes for colorful anime presentation, and it fits the game's tone really well. The environments are detailed enough to stay pleasant to look at. Character expressions do a lot of work during dialogue scenes, and the whole thing carries a kind of bright, feudal fantasy charm that makes it easy to spend time with. Even the fan service heavy parts feel like they're being filtered through a tone that's more playful than aggressive. Depending on the player, that will either be part of the appeal, or something they wish were toned down. Either way, the game's visual identity is consistent. The writing lands because it keeps returning to Sakura and Suzune. Even when the broader story gets predictable, and it does sometimes, the relationship keeps the game grounded. Sakura isn't just grinding for power. She's trying to become someone steadier, someone worthy of teaching, someone who can stand in front of Suzune without being defined by failure anymore. That gives even the simpler story beats a little extra weight. Of course, the game isn't flawless. Extended dungeon sections can start to blur together. The combat loop, while satisfying, does not endlessly evolve. If you binge the game too hard, you'll feel where the repetition starts pressing against the edges. Some people will also want more complexity from the plot, because the underdog story, mentorship angle, and tournament structure all follow familiar beats. But there's a reason so many people respond well to this one. It knows its scale. It knows what emotional note it wants to hit, and instead of overstretching itself, it focuses on making the central progression feel good. Sakura Gozen ends up being the kind of game that's easy to underestimate and very easy to keep playing once you understand its rhythm. It's compact, readable, charming, and anchored by a relationship that gives the whole thing heart. If you like action RPGs with a steady improvement loop and a strong emotional core, this is one you should check out sooner rather than later. Survivor Strain is the kind of game that grabs people through mood first and then keeps them around through character investment. The setup is instantly strong. The world ended 2 years ago. The first wave of infection already tore civilization apart, and you're playing as a tourist stranded in South America with no clean path home, no easy understanding of the environment, and no guarantee that anyone you meet will stay useful, trustworthy, or even alive. That opening alone gives the game a different feel from a lot of visual novels in this space. It doesn't start from comfort, it starts from damage already done. The world is broken in a way that feels lived in. Cities are not burning in the dramatic, the apocalypse is happening right now sense. They've already been consumed, abandoned, repurposed, or stripped down to dangerous shells. The infected are still a threat, but they're only part of the pressure. Human factions are just as dangerous, and in some ways more interesting, because they carry ideology with them. That's one of the things Survivor Strain handles well. It doesn't reduce its world to monsters and victims. Everyone surviving has some angle, some compromise, some reason they ended up where they are. As the protagonist, you're not just wandering through that chaos alone. The game is heavily built around assembling a group, and that group becomes your emotional anchor. Recruiting survivors, understanding their backgrounds, deciding who to trust, and figuring out what kind of leader you're becoming. That's the real game. The infected provide tension, the factions provide structure, but the relationships are what make the story stick. That's where the choice system earns its place. A lot of choice-driven visual novels talk a big game about player agency, and then quietly funnel you toward the same emotional beats. Survivor Strain does a better job than most at making your decisions feel like they shape the social atmosphere around your character. You can become more compassionate, more ruthless, more manipulative, more practical, And the important thing is that the game lets those choices affect not just who likes you, but what kind of group dynamic you're building. That matters because the cast is one of the game's biggest strengths. Characters aren't there just to fill space between plot events. They come with baggage, emotional scars, loyalties, trauma, hope, and the kind of friction that naturally appears when people are forced to survive together in a world that stopped rewarding decency. Some are easier to trust than others. Some clearly want something from you. Some feel like they're one bad day away from breaking. That gives the story a lot more tension than a simple pick your favorite route structure. The faction side helps too. Different groups in the world have their own goals, and you're constantly deciding how close you want to get to them. Ally with them, use them, oppose them, stay independent. None of those paths feel clean. That's one of the reasons the game's survival theme works. It understands that in a post-collapse world, morality is rarely simple. You're balancing ideals against safety, loyalty against efficiency, and emotion against long-term survival. Presentation plays a huge role in making all this hit. Survivor Strain uses fully 3D rendered characters and environments, and compared to a lot of adult visual novels, the production value stands out immediately. Characters are expressive, scenes are staged with more cinematic confidence, and the environments do a solid job of selling the collapse without needing constant spectacle. You've got ruined spaces, improvised safe zones, dangerous territory, and enough visual polish to make the world feel coherent, rather than stitched together. That polish helps the slower sections too, because make no mistake, this is still a dialogue-heavy experience. There are long stretches where the game is focused on conversations, faction dynamics, emotional fallout, and relationship development. If you're expecting constant plot escalation, you might feel the pacing slow down more than once. But if you're invested in the people, those slower moments usually work because they're the parts where you feel the cost of the world most clearly. The infected themselves are handled well as a narrative pressure source. They're not just zombie reskin number 3. Different strains and mutated forms give the threat some variety, and that variety helps maintain tension because you never feel like the outside danger has been fully solved or reduced to routine. Even when the game is deep in group drama, the infected remain a reminder that the world itself is still hostile. Romance exists, but it's folded into the survival story rather than replacing it. That's important. The game gives players the option to pursue those paths, but they don't overwhelm the larger structure unless you want them to. That helps the narrative maintain its tone. It still feels like a post-apocalyptic survival story first, with intimacy and connection growing inside that pressure instead of becoming the only thing the game cares about. The biggest criticism the game gets is pacing, and that's fair. It's a season-based release, and you can feel the structure of that. There are moments where the story clearly wants to build tension over time, but because of the episodic design, some players end up feeling like the season ends right when the story is really starting to hit its stride. There's also the issue that, despite meaningful choices, the overall route framework remains more controlled than some players might expect. You can shape the tone and outcomes, but you're still moving along a defined spine. Still, the strong finale helps a lot. It doesn't feel like the game just stops. It feels like it lands on a note that makes you want more, which is exactly what a first season should do. Survivor Strain works because it understands the value of emotional tension in survival fiction. The world is dangerous, yes, but the real hook is what happens when people try to build fragile forms of trust inside that danger. It's polished, cinematic, and much stronger on character work than people might assume at first glance. If you like narrative-heavy games where your decisions shape the emotional structure of the story, this is one you absolutely need to have on your radar. Harem in Another World is one of those games where you understand the premise immediately, but the reason people keep playing it has less to do with the premise itself and more to do with how easy it is to settle into its sandbox loop. It's an isekai setup? Sure. Regular guy gets transported into a fantasy world with friends, ends up surrounded by chaos, new races, missing people, and more distractions than any normal person should be able to manage. That part is familiar. What gives the game its identity is how little interest it has in pretending the protagonist is some noble chosen hero. He's selfish, he's reactive, he's kind of a mess, and the game knows that. That tone matters a lot. Instead of building itself around destiny, sacrifice, or giant moral themes, Harem in Another World leans into comedy, self-awareness, and relaxed progression. The main story exists. There's a larger threat hanging over the world, And yes, the missing friends are a real objective, but the game is much more interested in letting you wander, recruit characters, improve your home base, and get caught up in side content for way longer than you planned. That's the real hook. The world map is large enough that you feel like you've got room to roam, and the game encourages that. You're moving between regions, meeting humans, goblins, ghosts, giants, and all kinds of fantasy-adjacent weirdness, picking up quests, finding secrets, unlocking scenes, and gradually building a crew around you. The sense of freedom is one of the main reasons the game clicks with its audience. You don't feel boxed into one path. You feel like you're poking around a world that's happy to let you get distracted. And the distractions are the game. That's also why the Harem part works more as a gameplay structure than just a title gimmick. Relationship building isn't sitting off to the side like optional fluff. Recruiting characters, getting to know them, bringing them back to your base, and watching that base grow because of who you found. That's the progression. The home area starts becoming this reflection of your journey, and there's something satisfying about seeing it expand and fill out over time. New rooms, new functions, more people around, more life in the space. It turns the base into a reward loop. This is where the sandbox design really carries the experience. Even when the combat or main story isn't doing anything especially deep, the game can stay compelling because there's always another small thing to check. Maybe there's a character route you haven't pushed yet. Maybe you found materials for an upgrade. Maybe you opened a new area. Maybe you just want to see how the next conversation plays out. It's the kind of game that thrives on, "I'll just do one more thing" energy. Combat is probably the weakest major pillar, and the game knows it. Encounters are simple, accessible, and functional, but they're not carrying the experience by themselves. If you come into Harem in another world expecting deep tactical systems or an action loop that evolves dramatically, you're probably going to feel the repetition early. Fights do their job, progression gives them some structure, but the real appeal is everything wrapped around them. That's not necessarily a flaw, it just means the game's priorities are obvious. The art is a huge part of why those priorities work. Hand-drawn 2D anime visuals, expressive character work, a large amount of animation, and a cast designed to stand out. All of that gives the world a lot of immediate appeal. Even people who criticize the mechanics tend to admit that the character art is one of the strongest reasons to keep moving through the game. When you're playing something this relationship-driven, that matters. The humor also helps. The protagonist's self-awareness, the oddball cast, the slightly ridiculous structure of the world. The game doesn't demand that you take it too seriously. That makes the slower or shallower parts easier to accept because the whole experience is framed like a fantasy sandbox built for messing around, recruiting people, and seeing what happens when you keep saying yes to detours. Of course, that same looseness is also why some players come away feeling like the game never fully commits to being a stronger RPG. The systems can feel shallow. Exploration is fun, but not always mechanically rich. Combat is present, but not memorable. The story has interesting ideas, but often feels secondary to the sandbox rhythm. So the overall experience can land differently depending on what you want out of it. If you want structure, heavy stakes, and tightly layered mechanics, you may end up wishing it went further. If you want freedom, humor, relaxed progression, and a lot of character-driven content, it's much easier to get hooked. That divide in reception makes sense. Harem in Another World is not trying to be elegant. It's trying to be entertaining, wide open, and comfortable with its own excess. That gives it a messier identity than the other games on this list, but also a very easy one to remember. And because player time can vary so much depending on how much side content you chase, it's one of those games where two people can walk away feeling like they played very different versions of the same thing. At its best, it feels like a laid-back fantasy sandbox with strong visual appeal, a satisfying home growth loop, and enough character variety to keep the world lively. At its weakest, it can feel like a bundle of decent ideas that never fully deepen into something stronger. But even with that inconsistency, it has enough personality and enough momentum to be worth knowing about, especially if the idea of an open-ended spicy isekai sandbox already sounds like your kind of chaos. Serendipity Morning Mist is probably the most intimate game on this list, and also the one least interested in gameplay, in the traditional sense. It doesn't hook you with combat, progression trees, or giant branching systems that send the story in 10 different directions. It hooks you with the feeling that something important is ending, that both characters know it, and that they're choosing to spend their final days together, pretending the ending doesn't exist. That setup alone is strong. The premise is simple. Chisa, your long-term girlfriend, tells you she'll be leaving to study abroad, and that decision is final. There's no dramatic twist coming to save the relationship, no villain to defeat, no miracle plan to stop time. The two of you make a silent agreement that for the final 5 days together, you'll live in the present and act like nothing is about to change. That choice becomes the emotional structure of the game. Each day is a chapter, and each chapter is built from tiny things: waking up together, eating, talking, sitting in the same room, drifting through familiar routines with the weight of what's coming sitting quietly behind every interaction. That's what makes the game stand out. It understands that intimacy is often made of repetition. Same room, same person, same gestures, same voice, same smell in the air, same tension that grows heavier. Because nobody wants to say the obvious thing out loud. A lot of players will either connect deeply with that or feel like the game is too soft-spoken for its own good. Because Serendipity Morning Mist is not built around big plot turns. It's built around emotional accumulation. The story is subtle on purpose. It's less interested in what happens next than in what does this moment feel like when you know it won't last. That makes the whole experience far more reflective than dramatic. Gameplay is minimal. You're progressing through dialogue, choices, and small interactions that shape the tone rather than transforming the broader outcome. That's important to understand going in. This is not a visual novel, where you radically redirect the story through a giant decision tree. Your choices affect the emotional texture of the relationship, the way moments are remembered, and the angle from which you experience those 5 days. The overall destination remains close. The meaning changes in the details. That design works really well with the perspective system. Being able to switch between first-person and third-person views adds more than you'd think. In first person, the story feels more immediate, more intimate, almost uncomfortably close at times. In third person, there's more distance, more reflection, more room to feel like you're watching something fragile play out. That small structural choice adds a lot to replay value, because it changes how scenes land emotionally without needing the plot to become radically different. Presentation is where the game punches above its weight. The live 2D work, the facial expressions, the voice acting, the lighting, the room design, all of it is aimed at creating a very soft, melancholic atmosphere. Chisa's voice does a huge amount of emotional work. Tiny changes in tone, hesitation, warmth, awkwardness, restraint. That performance carries the game's quietest moments. The visuals do the same. Nothing is overly loud or exaggerated. It's carefully built to make closeness feel real. And because the game stays mostly inside a small emotional space, those details matter more than ever. That also explains the mixed reception. For people who want a short, intimate, melancholy visual novel about presence, memory, and quiet emotional pain, Serendipity Morning Mist can hit hard. Some players describe it as beautiful, intimate, and difficult to shake after finishing. Others come away feeling like the subtlety goes so far that the story risks feeling too restrained, too repetitive, or too slight for its runtime and price. Both reactions make sense. The repetition is deliberate, but it's still repetition. 5 days of similar routines can either feel realistic and emotionally effective, or feel like the game is circling the same emotional point too often. That depends a lot on how much a player values atmosphere over momentum. If you need plot escalation, this may feel too quiet. If you're willing to let tone carry the experience, it becomes a lot more affecting. Another thing worth pointing out is how firmly the game centers acceptance rather than resolution. That's rare. A lot of romance stories are built around fixing something, reclaiming something, or forcing emotional closure into a neat shape. Serendipity Morning Mist is much more interested in the idea that some endings do not arrive with answers. Sometimes people part because life moves. Sometimes what matters most is how you spend the time before the parting becomes final. That makes the game feel less like a fantasy and more like a memory being built in real time. The mature side of the story is tied directly into that intimacy. It's not treated like a separate reward path. It's part of how the game expresses closeness, fear of loss, and the desire to hold on to the present for just a little longer. For some players, that strengthens the emotional core. For others, it narrows the game's appeal and keeps it locked inside a very specific niche. Again, both reactions are understandable. At the end of the day, Serendipity Morning Mist is a very specific kind of visual novel. Short, quiet, intimate, and more interested in emotional texture than dramatic structure. It won't work for everyone, and it doesn't try to. But for players who like slow, reflective, character-focused stories about love and impermanence, it can leave a much deeper mark than a louder game ever could. So yeah, that's the list. 5 spicy games that are all doing very different things, but all deserve attention right now for one reason or another. A brutal, side-scrolling sci-fi nightmare. A samurai underdog story with real heart. A cinematic post-apocalypse full of survival choices. An open-ended fantasy sandbox built around characters and chaos. And a quiet, emotional visual novel that hits through atmosphere instead of spectacle. That's the thing I keep coming back to with this niche. The best spicy games are rarely just one thing. They experiment. They take risks. Sometimes they overshoot. Sometimes they end up way more memorable because they overshoot. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Which one of these would you check out first? No judgment here.